Hi and welcome to this week's Property Insider video. Today I'm going to have a chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson about the latest property data. We're also going to talk about the disappearing property investors, what the latest finance figures are showing, and also the surge in first home buyers. We're going to chat about Josh Freidenberg's admission about the real unemployment rate, falling consumer confidence, what's happening with the Melbourne lockdown and where New South Wales has decided not to lock down, and how that's going to affect our property markets. If you'd like to keep up to date with the latest property news, each week we present this Property Insiders video, so click the subscribe button so that you can be kept up to date, and if you click the little bell icon, YouTube will let you know when the next show is out. If you were told in January what April 2020 would look like, you wouldn't have believed it. If you were told in May that in July we'd have lockdown stage 2 in Victoria, you wouldn't have believed it either. So how do you begin to make sense of the future when things change so fast? That's what we're going to discuss in this week's Property Insider chat with Australia's leading housing economist, Dr. Andrew Wilson, Chief Economist of My Housing Market, as he updates us in what's happening with our property markets. We're also going to have a chat about a lot of the economic and political factors affecting our property markets. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Well, before we get into the heavy stuff like the finance data and the disappearance of property investors, the New South Wales new decisions about lockdown, first home buyers, falling consumer confidence, there's so many things to discuss. Let's have a little talk about what's happening currently in our property markets.
Well, Michael, of course, our last episode was prior to the lockdown policies being reintroduced into Melbourne. We didn't have any real sense of how the market was going to react to that. So since then, of course, we've had some of those leading indicators of housing market activity. The first, of course, our weekend auction clearance rates. And quite interestingly, Michael, we had a disparity between the results from the providers of those clearance rates, which are quite unusual not to see them tracking at around about the same level. The core logic data had Melbourne clearance rates above 60% into the mid-60s, whereas the domain rates and the auction insider rates, which I produce, were under 50% in the 40s. And of course, we know that one of the key aspects of that lower clearance rate from domain and from auction insider was the high number of withdrawals. We saw that same occurrence back in April when we first had that shutdown of auction activity through the banning of open air auctions and open for inspections, which of course we've got now in Melbourne. And that meant that a lot of vendors who had booked in their auctions withdrew them prior to the auction date. And of course, as withdrawals are included as a non-sale, that really did push the clearance rates down quite sharply. We saw that again with those high withdrawal numbers, predictably, in Melbourne, pushing those clearance rates down under 50% again. And we'll find out more clearly with the results this coming weekend, Michael, is that the core logic data takes the full week of results rather than the Saturday night. But nonetheless, it's logical to assume that we would have had a high number of withdrawals of auctions as a result of banning of open air auctions in Melbourne and open for inspections. And those high withdrawal numbers, as it happened in April, would have acted to pull down the clearance rate, as we saw in some of the models. However, the core logic model went the other way.
Well, more auctions are going online, but you're 100% correct. The sense we got in the Melbourne market was it only happened Thursday morning. People suddenly had to make a decision. Do I go to an online auction or do I withdraw and go to private treaty? So it doesn't mean those properties won't sell. It means that the statistics reported on a Saturday aren't as accurate as they used to be when we had a normal market.
And we need a longer view. Last weekend's results were affected by the fact that it was the midweek shutdown. So we need to have a full weekend where everybody's on the same page to get those insights into the marketplace again. But look, some other data which we normally look at on a week-by-week basis. We saw a dip in national listings over the past week. Probably no surprise, new listings coming through were affected by not just the lockdown in Melbourne, but also the widespread sentiment that perhaps we may get more lockdowns in other states. That may have acted as a handbrake for vendors deciding to put their property into housing markets. But we have seen a consolidation of that over recent days, Michael. That's flattened. And interestingly, if we look at the comparisons with new listings to a year ago, we were ahead. Actually, the new listings data was higher this year than it was at the same time last year, but we're now starting to see that falling back towards the numbers last year. So that'll be interesting to see how that pans out as well. But of course, we did start to see a significant revival in the market last year around this time, Michael. New listings were certainly coming into the market. Of course, we had an interest rate cut this time last year as well. So all things were certainly growing in terms of momentum. But overall, national listings we've seen are now up 8.9% over the week. However, national new sales fell by 6.2% week on week. If we look at the figures, no surprise that new listings in Melbourne were actually down 6.7% over the week, Michael. New listings in Sydney were up by 13.4%. And I think if we just briefly make mention of announcement by the Premier of New South Wales that they will be unlikely to be going into any lockdowns as a result of any coronavirus outbreaks. They're going to contain it at the local level. And I think that's good news for the New South Wales economy and certainly good news for the Sydney housing market. And I think what it does is it obviously now gives us certainly a differentiation between policies from state to state. So I think this is good news for the economy of New South Wales and good news for the Sydney housing market.
Well, it's going to be good news for consumers because consumer confidence fell again. And that's one of the reasons people are nervous about buying and nervous about selling. For the third week in a row, the ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Index slipped. It's down to a 9-week low now. Sure, it's up from the highs of March when we were really in terror, but consumers and businesses are not feeling confident. So the government of New South Wales giving some certainty that the wheels of industry are still going to keep turning. That's got to be good for property.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. And we've also seen, not surprisingly, the share market falling away, not sharply, but certainly easing from what was a reasonable upswing over the last month or so. It's fallen back slightly, but again, the share market remains a hostage to what happens in the US. But nonetheless, it's still up. It's well above its lows of April and has responded, I guess, similarly as the consumer sentiment surveys have to, in terms of easing, in terms of the bad news that we've had in terms of the lockdown in Melbourne last week.
Now, recently, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released its finance figures for finance commitments, but that was May. This is the problem. We're already in July now, but finance fell to very low levels.
Yeah.
But when you dug deeper, as we're going to have a look at your charts in a moment, there were some interesting trends coming out of it, Andrew.
Well, look, firstly, Michael, we shouldn't be surprised. It was a record monthly fall in new housing loan approvals. Of course, how do you get a loan if you're locked in your home? It's not very easy to go and visit the bank and do the normal process of securing a home loan. So we shouldn't be surprised at that, not just the issues of sentiment, but actually the physical constraints to getting on with securing a home loan. But when we look at beyond that monthly data, at the data for this year so far, we can see that housing loans approved are still tracking higher than where they were over the same first 5 months of last year. So really, in terms of the year so far, housing loan activity generally is well ahead of where it was at the same period last year. And of course, that's because the first 5 months of last year, we were in a significant gloom and doom environment, which was keeping activity subdued. And of course, we did see that turn around over the second half of the year. Record low fall, but there's plenty of reasons for it that aren't related to the housing market. And we know that because we've seen price data benign over that period that's been released. So we haven't seen a collapse in price as we would expect from lower housing loans. But there are some other interesting aspects, I think, that are worth looking at in terms of that housing loan data, Michael, rather than the volatile month-to-month changes.
Well, clearly we shouldn't be paying too much attention to that particular month because it was a reflection, as you say, of what happened in the previous months. One of the things I found really interesting was the large percentage of refinances. But again, that's not surprising when the interest rates are so low. 64% of refinances, though, were to other lenders. People are switching lenders. So they've realised that they shouldn't have to pay a loyalty tax. Doesn't matter what colour logo's on your bank statement. When it comes, people are looking for good interest rates at the moment, Andrew.
Yeah, that's right, Michael. Clear inducements to do the best deal you can under difficult and potentially ongoing difficult economic circumstances, of course, motivated people to change their banks. And of course, banks are also in the position where they're actively competing with each other in a market environment which has seen falling aggregate loans. So they're interested in getting new business from other banks. And so it's all a bit of a perfect storm there for that refinancing data.
And first home buyers, they were very active, weren't they?
If we look a bit deeper into those finance stats, Michael, we can see a continuing trend really over the last 2 years, particularly over the last year anyway, and that's first home buyers are still quite active in the marketplace. Yes, they were down, but their numbers as a proportion of total lending is holding up quite significantly. So first home buyers, and we know that, and we've discussed that here, really even in the depths of the bad news cycle or higher interest rates, are certainly still happy to engage the market and to become actual first home buyers, and we're seeing that. Of course, we know those numbers will improve because on the 1st of July, we have another 10,000 places that have been released for the government's first home buyer deposit scheme. So there'll be more first home buyers into the marketplace over July. Of course, we won't get those figures for a couple of months. So first home buyers are ticking over quite reasonably. I do hope the government provides more stimulus for first home buyers. I think it's almost a no-brainer to keep our economy on the rise, if possible, is to bring those first home buyers in larger numbers into our housing markets. But the real, I guess, interesting point to the stats in terms of the underlying energy, Michael, was again very low investor numbers. We've seen a collapse in investor activity, lending activity over the last really 2 years, but it's now accelerating. It's almost bizarre to see that the proportion of lending overall for first home buyers and for investors is almost the same. We're now starting to see the market share for first investors down around 20%, where typically over the longer term, it's averages around 35 to 40%. Of course, this is a product of the credit squeeze initially, where banks were not interested in lending to investors. But now, of course, we're starting to see some disruptions in the investor market in terms of high vacancies in Melbourne apartments or Melbourne CBD apartments and in a Sydney apartments. And that's going to put some more pressure on investor activity. But look, I really think that this has been almost a predictable outcome, even prior to coronavirus, with those highly questionable policies of constraining investor activity that we've seen over a number of years. And now we're seeing a very important part of our housing market at the lowest levels. It's the monthly numbers for investors, Michael, May were the lowest since 2002. And those numbers aren't adjusted for inflation, that's value. So that's just quite extraordinary to have such low numbers of investors in the marketplace. And we need investors to start to get active to be part of the economic revival, as we've seen in previous downturns. And we don't have the low interest rate potential to sort of make that happen as it has previously. And now we have this culture of negativity towards investors.
Clearly, there's a combination, as you said. There's the investors who are sitting on the sideline waiting for somebody to ring a bell saying, hey, the market's bottomed, it's not going to drop anymore. So it's more the beginning investor who we're finding is a bit more nervous. The more seasoned investors, people who've been around the block a few times, are seeing that this is a good counter-cyclical opportunity, but they're having difficulty getting finance. So the combination of factors. But back to the first home buyers, they're taking advantage of the low interest rates. They're also taking advantage of the bank of mum and dad. Some recent statistics are suggesting parents are helping first home buyers get into the market. And of course, there's the home builder grant as well, which has seen a huge surge in new construction over the last month, or at least commitment for construction. Maybe it's going to have the effect it wanted, Andrew.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. And that's been a good policy from the government. All praise to them for that. Its take-up has been higher than I perhaps anticipated, but nonetheless, it just does show that latent energy in our housing markets that is there to be tapped. That tends to override the sort of hysteria we get in the media. But as I say, I think there's still some more work to be done. Not everybody wants to live in a new house on the fringe, and that does favour the Melbourne market and the Brisbane market to some degree. We need to be able to find other ways of nurturing the housing market, particularly the Sydney housing market. And I think in terms of, as you mentioned, the anti-cyclical environment, Michael, well, absolutely. If we know that those investors that were sidelined either through the credit squeeze or lack of confidence a year ago, those that didn't weren't sidelined and purchased properties in a selective manner. And I think it's always important to be selective if you are an investor going forward. And that's all about looking at credible information. What we've seen, of course, is that even with a fall over the June quarter in house prices generally, that the Sydney market is still 12% higher in terms of the median house price than it was over last June. So certainly those investors that did move into the market and were successful getting finance have been able to take advantage of higher prices. And of course, they've been taking advantage of lower interest rates since then as well, Michael. Of course, we have some potential disruptions in our investor market at the moment, but that's more specific areas. Inner city Sydney and CBD Melbourne certainly have high vacancies at the moment. But interestingly, we're seeing lower vacancies in houses in both Sydney and Melbourne. So vacancy rates are actually falling in Sydney and Melbourne for houses. So that's quite, as I said, it swings and roundabouts to some degree. But I think the lesson there is to be selective in terms of doing your homework.
I think that's a good lesson, being selective. And I think first home buyers should remember the government home builder program is actually a program to help home builders, construction industry, grease the wheels of industry, not to help home buyers. And so therefore some are unfortunately going to buy those properties in the outer suburbs that may not have the capital growth the inner suburbs will have, or maybe get emotionally involved and overcommit themselves. So remember what the purpose of that program is. Another interesting news item this week was an admission by Treasurer Josh Freidenberg of what's really happening with unemployment figures. We discuss them regularly and you've been digging deeper into them, but he was suggesting that the headline unemployment rate of 7.1% isn't really an accurate description of what's going on in the workforce, Andrew.
We've had this debate in terms of what we saw with the impact of the coronavirus shutdown, Michael, was an extraordinary number of people not just lost their jobs, but also withdrew from the workforce. Obviously, some of those jobs are being supported that could have been lost are being supported by the JobKeeper allowance. So we could perhaps take that into consideration as well and notionally align those with unemployment rates again. But if we do add the number of people who have left the workforce because, well, they've given up looking for work, and if we add that to the number of unemployed, on my data, that gives us, and close to the Treasurer's data, an unemployment rate of nearly 12%. We're really comparing apples with oranges here, Michael, I think to some degree. People left the workforce means they're not actively seeking work. Obviously, they would have been discouraged from the prospects of gaining a job, but it's because perhaps they have an alternative income source that they can rely on anyway. And that the fact is, in terms of the statistical measures, Michael, it's no use saying there could be this or it could be that. We use a standard statistical measure that gives us a long-term series of unemployment rates that we can compare from period to period. Now, we have come from a very high period of participation in the workforce, and that actually helped to keep the unemployment rate a little higher than it could have been in some respects. But the point is that a lot of job seekers or that were non-job seekers came into the workforce by looking for jobs because they were finding it hard to survive in a low income environment. So those were looking to supplement their incomes with another job, particularly older Australians. Now, obviously, to some degree, we've seen them discouraged, as I just said before, and left the workforce. Now, whether this means we have an 11% unemployment rate, well, that's highly ambiguous, to be quite honest. But I think let's just leave it at where it is at the moment and worry enough about how high that is. And of course, this week, Michael, we will get the latest unemployment figures, the June unemployment figures, and that's going to be very, very interesting. And that's really the key to everything and every month when we get those unemployment statistics. And
well, with Victoria being locked down, clearly
yes,
we're going to have more challenges in Victoria with unemployment, and New South Wales saying we're not going to do a total lockdown. That's encouraging for small businesses and to keep employment up. I guess it also suggests that Josh Freidenberg is going to be looking at employment figures when he's preparing his July 23rd budget update. That's going to bring some interesting discussions, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, Michael. And look, they've still got to be front and centre in terms of providing stimulus to the economy. We don't have lower interest rates to use this time in terms of previous economic downturns where we've been able to slash interest rates. We don't have anywhere to go in terms of lower interest rates. So it's over to you, government, and they've got to do what it takes. And as I said, I still think there's plenty of opportunity to stimulate the housing market. And you're absolutely right. It's a good thing that home builder allowance in terms of the building industry. There are plenty of downstream positives for stimulating established housing markets as well. I think the key is to always have a sunset clause with those types of policies that stimulate activity in the broader housing market. And of course, that means demand is brought forward and perhaps we do get a surge in prices, but it does mean that we get economic activity as a result. And that's the most important thing to be thinking about right now is jobs, Michael.
I think one last thing I'd like to mention is with a lot of us not being able to travel overseas anymore, there's going to be people who would have spent their money overseas now able to spend it locally. As long as they allow us to start travelling and the interstate borders open up eventually, there's some good news there as well, that we are going to have that pent-up demand for enjoyment, for vacations, for buying things. And interestingly, Andrew, I read that Mercedes sold more cars in June than they have for months and months. So there is pent-up demand in certain segments.
And of course, that the tax deductible allowance, capital allowance, was part of that energy, Michael. And we've just got to move through the shutdown environments. New South Wales is leading the charge in this at the moment. All power to them. Going forward, let's hope that Victoria can get its issues with the coronavirus under control, and then we can move forward with a lot more optimism in terms of the outlook.
Sounds good. Look forward to our chat again next week, Andrew.
Thanks, Michael.